we have all been watching, horrified at what's happening around the country. Started in Minnesota, obviously, in Minneapolis, with the death of George Floyd. Tragic, terrible death. And has spread now to cities across the country, including to North Dakota. Not just the protests in Fargo, which unfortunately turned violent, but there have been demonstrations in communities across our state. Bismarck, even my home here in Minot, has had some peaceful demonstrations. I think the question right now is, I mean, everybody is talking about the protests and obviously some of them turning violent. And I would like the discussion to be, what do we do about this? I mean, as a practical matter of public policy, because there's a lot of slogans going on out there. There's a lot of chants. There's a lot of signs being waved. There's a lot of social media posts being posted. But I'm interested in what can we do as a matter of public policy to fix this situation. Here to talk with me about that is Fargo defense attorney Mark Friese. And Mark, I think, always has a very unique perspective on this because Mark's a former cop. Used to work as a cop for the Bismarck Police Department, but now works, dare I say, on the other side of the criminal justice system as a criminal defense attorney. So, Mark, I always appreciate your perspective on these things, and I wanted to ask you, what do we do about this? And I have a feeling there's probably some things we could do immediately, and there's probably some things that need to be long-term projects, but how do we get to a point where law enforcement is better? Because I think we've reached a place where there's, if not universal agreement, there's at least majority agreement that something's got to give. So something's got to change.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with you. I like to think that I have some objectivity from seeing both perspectives. I represent police officers on a day-to-day basis, and I file claims against police officers on a day-to-day basis. But I think the answer to this is to hold the courts accountable, number one. So the courts, and we can talk about that in a little bit, but hold the courts accountable. But more importantly is we need to turn to the legislative branch of government to establish a framework that will provide protections to people and will take away some of the background and some of the incentives that the police have had historically to treat people disparately. So I was sketching out some thoughts as I was waiting for your call this morning, and I really came up with kind of a 10-step or 10 areas where we could make major impact. But the first would be to turn to the lawmaking branch to have them implement meaningful reforms.
What are those reforms?
The first one, kind of the impetus for your call, was a discussion from a USA Today article earlier this week about abolishing qualified immunity. Qualified immunity was created by the United States Supreme Court in response to civil lawsuits filed against law enforcement officers and governmental officials. And we kind of got to step into this. Historically, it was impossible to sue the government. It's called sovereign immunity or absolute immunity. This comes from the English common law, and it basically means the king can do no wrong. So citizens could not historically sue the government unless the government would allow itself to be sued. And it makes sense. We don't want people to sue lawmakers for making laws or judges for making decisions. So absolute immunity continues to apply to those people, but there's a separate branch.
Well, one area, I mean, just to illustrate that, like one area that was interesting to me, has always been interesting to me, is the immunity that prosecutors have from like slander and libel laws. I mean, so the job of a prosecutor is to go out and to prosecute somebody. And as a part of that, you know, the prosecutor has to talk about that person as if they're guilty, right? That's the prosecutor's job. Like the prosecutor has been convinced that this person is guilty, so the prosecutor is going to go out and say things like, I think this person's guilty. I think he murdered those people. Me in the news media, you know, we have to use that keyword alleged, right? Until there's a conviction, we say alleged, but the prosecutor has immunity, because otherwise we might get sued for libel. But the prosecutor has immunity from that, and as well they should, because their job is to try to get a conviction, and it's hard to get a conviction if you're going around saying, well, these alleged crimes that I am trying to convict somebody of.
or in the same context, a lawmaker on the floor of the Legislative Assembly, we want open and wide debate, and sometimes salacious comments are made, sometimes
Sure.
offensive comments are made, and we want to protect lawmakers because we want to have that type of debate. So absolutely right, Rob. Those folks are entitled to absolute immunity. You cannot sue them. It's a bar to suing an entire complete bar. You can't sue a prosecutor. You can't sue a lawmaker under those circumstances that you just outlined. But what about the police officer who violates somebody's constitutional rights? Generally, historically, you could not sue the police officer for that type of conduct. However, the government can waive its sovereign immunity, or in instances where the police, a state police actor, has violated the constitutional rights, either state or federal constitutional rights of a person, immunity no longer applies. But what has happened is the United States Supreme Court, going back to this early case in 1982, recognizing police officers were not entitled to absolute immunity for violation of the constitutional rights of a person, they created this qualified immunity. And what qualified immunity says is that the police cannot be held liable unless there are certain conditions that are met under the statute or under the law that establishes the rights for the individual. So there's a lot of discussion currently going on nationwide about whether sovereign immunity should continue to exist, because over the last 15 years, the Supreme Court has expanded, the United States Supreme Court has expanded sovereign immunity that it makes it almost impossible to recover damages for a police officer's violation of civil rights. Much like the USA Today article outlined, if George Floyd's family goes to a Minnesota court, either state or federal court, and tries to sue the Minneapolis Police Department, it's likely that that case will be dismissed because there's no controlling case law from the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, in which Minnesota sits, that says it's a violation of clear civil rights or clearly established rights to kneel on somebody's neck for 9 minutes. It's atrocious that police have been given protections based on the fact that the complaining victim has to establish there's a case almost nearly on point where the courts have said this is improper.
This is hard. I think for those of us who are not lawyers, this is hard to wrap our minds around. I mean, because for most of us, I mean, you look at a video, and obviously, any given case is complicated, and there can always be mitigating factors and all those other things that usually apply, those caveats. But I think most of us looked at what happened to Derek Chauvin, kneeling on George Floyd's neck and saying, as George Floyd is saying he can't breathe, as onlookers are saying, hey, he can't breathe, get off his neck. And the guy's just sitting there. I think most of us can look at it and say, I mean, it is what it is, right? We're looking at it. It's staring us right in the face. We've all seen it. It's terrible. Why can't, I mean, how can we just say, oh, but because there's no, you're saying because there's no specific law? Like does the legislature have to write a specific law to say it's illegal to kneel on a person's neck for 9 minutes?
Let me give you another example, Rob, to try to explain this. And I agree, it gets to be kind of heady stuff. The Supreme Court, in developing qualified immunity, established a test. And that test requires that in order for the police to be brought into court, and this is a shield, this is a complete bar from prosecution in the civil context. It's a complete bar from being brought into court. It's immunity. It's not a defense. It's an immunity. They're immune from suit. And the test is that the victim or the victim's family must show that the right that was violated was clearly established. You're 100% right. We all know that we have an absolute right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. We have an absolute right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, and those things seem clearly established. And it's like the typical example where you say, you know it when you see it. And we all know, everyone knows that looking at this Minneapolis police officer kneeling on this man's neck was wrong and it violated his rights. But the test that has been established for qualified immunity requires the victim to show that the right was clearly established. Well, how has the court filled that in? The example from the USA Today article, there was a case last November from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. A dog had attacked or was sicked on a suspect who had surrendered. The surrendered subject had knelt down, held up his hands, and then the police, even though the person was surrendering, sent their dog to attack the person. He sued. His suit was dismissed on qualified immunity grounds because there was a Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals decision that said it was impermissible to do this if the person surrendered by laying down with their hands to their side, but not if they surrendered by sitting or kneeling and raising their hands. That's how crazy this qualified immunity doctrine has become, and there's a very easy fix. The courts should not be creating this type of policy. The lawmakers, Congress, should convene and abolish qualified immunity and take it out of the hands of the courts. And they have the absolute right to do that.
How do they? Well, absolutely. In fact, sometimes, not you, Mark, sometimes I talk to lawyers and you would think that the judicial branch is also the legislative branch. We're always waiting for some judge somewhere to set some new precedent, and we're forgetting, hey, wait a minute. Courts don't write the laws, or at least they're not supposed to write the laws. The legislature writes the laws. So what would the legislature do? Just like we abolish qualified immunity? I mean, do we need to establish, like right into our state constitution, hey, we have a right to not be unduly battered or murdered by the police?
It's as simple as you outlined. We abolish qualified immunity. And they would have to, there has to be interplay with existing federal law and state law, so the language would have to be, drafted so that it covers the bases. But it would be that simple. They can enact a law that says we abolish qualified immunity. And by the way, that does not, by abolishing qualified immunity, that would not take away the right of law enforcement officers or others to assert defenses in these cases. We have police invariably are going to get into high-speed pursuits. They're going to get into physical altercations. They're going to get into circumstances where they have to use deadly force. And they can defend against those lawsuits by establishing it was the conduct of somebody else that caused them to engage in that, or that the conduct of others was the proximate cause of the damages that a victim has suffered. So it's not taking away the ability of police to defend against these cases. It's taking away the courts basically protecting them from being sued for egregious violations of constitutional rights.
The way it stands now, you can't even have the debate. Like, you can't even go to trial. Like, you file the suit and it just gets dismissed because qualified immunity. What you're saying is remove qualified immunity, then you can have the debate. Then you can have the trial. You come in and the plaintiff, makes their allegations and the defense makes their defense, and then, a judge or a jury decides and that moves on. But what you're saying is we need to allow that process to even happen in the first place.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And the court has gone too far. In the past 15 years, there have been 18 decisions of the United States Supreme Court on qualified immunity. 16 of the 18 cases, the court found the governmental defendants were entitled to qualified immunity on the grounds that whether they had acted in violation of the Constitution or not, they hadn't violated clearly established law. So, and it's really getting to the point that the lower courts are saying there has to be a controlling case almost factually identical to the one presently before the court, before the police officers can be brought in their individual capacities without being brought into court and successfully sued, or even being brought into the process.
I'm confused. I mean, isn't that a chicken and an egg thing? How do you get a case that's identical if the courts are dismissing all the cases?
The first victim loses, and then the next victim who is treated identically then is able to establish that they're entitled to relief, which is nonsensical. I agree.
Good Lord! All right.
The simple way is to abolish qualified immunity.
Yeah.
Now, a case like George Floyd's, I think that there are also political aspects of lawsuits. I would suspect that George Floyd's family is going to be compensated. You could never be compensated adequately enough for what had happened, but I suspect that they will be handsomely compensated, because if they are not, the public outcry, qualified immunity or not, the public outcry, if that family is not taken care of in the aftermath of this, politically just cannot be swallowed.
Because the government can waive qualified immunity, right? I mean, in a particular, it's just that a lot of times they don't. But in a case like George Floyd's, they're probably gonna, because, there's literal mobs in the street right now upset about this. So they're going to waive in I mean, some measure. It's hard to call it justice when you're getting money in exchange for losing a loved one. How is that justice? Nobody wanted that to happen, no good person wanted that to happen. But okay, so qualified immunity, the legislatures need to act. How does that work? I mean, does Congress need to say, if the state of North Dakota, like if North Dakota's legislature coming up here in 2021, when they have their next session, if they pass qualified immunity legislation, how does that also impact, like what if an FBI agent does it, right? Obviously that's not a state. I mean, that might cover highway patrol, but if an FBI agent does that in the state of North Dakota, because that's a federal officer, can we sue them? I mean, do we need Congress to act as well?
Yeah, we need Congress to act here because most of these cases are brought under federal law. There's a federal statute. They're often referred to as 1983 claims based on Section 1983, 42 United States Code, Section 1983. They're sometimes called constitutional torts, but it's a civil action under federal law for deprivation of rights. And if for example, I'm beat up by a police officer somewhere in North Dakota, pick any city, a state actor acting under color of state law who deprives an individual of their rights can be sued in federal court under federal law. So, and you can be sued in state court applying the federal law, but the abolition of qualified immunity would have to be on a federal basis because it's a federal right and a federal statute that's being used.
So
states could provide some protection too, though.
Okay. So there is probably something our legislature needs to do, and hopefully we'll have that debate early next year. Qualified immunity can only be a part of this, though, because I'm going through all this and I'm thinking, okay, good, we're going to hold law enforcement financially accountable, except holding law enforcement financially accountable, it's the taxpayers that are going to have to dole out. So a cop goes and harms somebody, acts inappropriately, and the taxpayers are the one that pay, right? Because it's the police department that's getting sued. So as a taxpayer, I think we need more than that. I mean, I want to give whatever measure of justice we can give. And again, it's hard to call in a situation like this, money in exchange for a human life justice. But I guess that's what we have in front of us. But what else can we do? I mean, if qualified immunity goes away, but that's just part of it. What else do we do to create a situation where, in some of these communities, we could trust cops again?
I have a long list. In some states and some cities do a better job than others. I'm trying to make this as close to home as possible, but I think we need to demilitarize the police. Historically, professional policing has at common law, when our country was founded, there were only a handful of crimes. We didn't need professional police officers. We had part-time police officers and the right of arrest by private citizens. But we've expanded the scope of criminal law so far, and in response to the expansion of the scope of criminal law, we've created professional police, and police have modeled themselves after the military. And instead of having the law enforcement officer who is a peacekeeper, a public servant, a member of the community who's there to serve and unlock car doors and help citizens, we've created a militaristic type of police model, and it doesn't work well because citizens don't respond well to being treated like enemy combatants. That's a long, large policy issue subject to a great deal of debate, but I am of the view that we need to take the military aspects out of policing to the extent possible.
I remember I got a lot of heat because I got after the former Cass County Sheriff Paul Laney for talking about warrior cops. And I wrote a column saying, well, if you guys are warriors fight wars. Wars have sides and enemies. Who's the cop's enemy? Like, if you're patrolling and you think of yourself as a warrior and you're at war, then who's the enemy? Us? The public? Because that's not how I want it. I want law enforcement that's a part of the community, that's with the rest of us, and is empowered to obviously take on people who are doing, terrible things. So I agree with you on the militarization. But let me play devil's advocate for a minute, because we saw what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline protest, where we had people show up in North Dakota that were just bent on mayhem, they wanted to create situations where the cops had no choice but to use force. I think if you look at a lot of these protests, I think even a small faction, I think most of the Fargo protesters were peaceful, but I think there was definitely a faction that again was here bent on mayhem and was bent on forcing law enforcement to use force. I think there are people who would argue because those people exist in the world, they need some of this equipment. They need the riot shields. They need the batons and the vehicles and some of this other stuff. What do you say to that?
I say you're absolutely right that they do need that, and we cannot completely we cannot sacrifice the safety of law enforcement officers just for the feel good aspect of demilitarizing policing. They continue to need the protective equipment. There are certain circumstances where they need to employ military-like tactics. There are certain circumstances where they need Bearcat armored vehicles and those types of things. But they don't need them to the extent that they're using them. And that kind of segues into the third recommendation that I would have is training. Train about dealing with minorities, train about when and where to use certain types of tactics, train in use of force continuums, and provide training to police. But you're right, we cannot completely take the military aspects out, but we can reduce and minimize them and use them only when necessary.
It's more a philosophical shift. I mean, I feel like what we're talking about here, it's less about the specific armor, but it's about philosophy. It's about the approach to law enforcement. I'm fine with them having some of that equipment because sometimes in extreme situations, they need it. I don't know that it's really specifically about the equipment. I think it's about the philosophy of the officers. Am I wrong?
I think so, but there is a message being sent too. If you're dispatching a SWAT team because a drug dog hit on an apartment at a college complex, there's a message sent, right? Oftentimes, police can knock on the door and serve a search warrant without breaking the door down, and it's more than a philosophical shift. It's a systematic. It's training. It's convincing police officers that they're not fighting an enemy combatant, but they're dealing with citizens who are taxpayers and have families and what have you. So, I think it's a philosophical shift. The next comment that I would have for you, I think you're going to find kind of incredible coming from a guy who makes his living by representing people charged with crimes, but we need to decriminalize a lot of the conduct that we currently have as crimes.
We need fewer laws. We need fewer laws.
We need fewer laws. We need fewer crimes. Right. We can have laws, right? And we can regulate people, but we should not be putting police in enforcement areas that they ought not be. For example, the governor recently has issued all sorts of executive orders about when businesses can open, which types of businesses can open, what people can and can't do, and then we turn to the police to enforce those, right? And we make it a crime. So the governor, by executive order, shuts down barbershop. I go in to get a haircut. We turn to the police to go arrest me and to arrest the barbershop owner, and we ought not be putting them in that place. We should make it a civil penalty where if there's a violation of an executive order, the person is brought in on a civil penalty and it's handled as a civil matter rather than a crime. And this goes to violations of the plumbing code, violations of the electrical code, and the hundreds and hundreds of things that we have described as crimes, which should be treated as civil matters rather than crimes.
One aspect of this debate, I think a lot of people are talking about this stuff like it's new, and it's not new. I wrote a column this week talking about another person who was upset about law enforcement abuse, and not unjustifiably. He was upset about Ruby Ridge in Idaho, where the ATF killed some people. He was upset about Waco, where the ATF burned some people to death. And then he ended up blowing up a federal building in Oklahoma City, Tim McVeigh. But Tim McVeigh was motivated by, and his actions were not justified. The man was a monster, disgusting individual, a white supremacist, terrible, terrible person. But was motivated by real law enforcement abuses, right? I think most of us could conclude, looking at the facts in Waco, that law enforcement was abusive there. Right? And it was a lot of the same problems we're talking about now. This big militaristic show of force over something that really, I mean, looking back at Waco, those people needed social workers, right? There were some problems there, and they needed social workers. They did not need cops and helicopters and tanks. but that's what they got. And 76 people died, 82 total, 76 burned to death, including a lot of children. So this is not new. We've been dealing with this for a long time.
And we're 3 decades later, and we're not any better about it. That's the good part about people protesting, and that's the good part about bad things happening, is it's reinvigorating the debate, and maybe people in positions to effectuate change will now listen more intently. I think another thing that we can do, and this is part of the debate as well, and this is an ongoing, long-standing debate, is we need to reduce or eliminate draconian criminal sentences, particularly in the federal courts, and we need to get rid of minimum mandatory sentences. I am a strong law and order advocate. I believe people who are found guilty of offenses need to pay a punishment for it, but our sentences are out of whack for the type of conduct, particularly in the federal system. And the federal system is notorious for prosecuting cases that are not prosecuted in the state system, cases arising out of the reservations, cases involving minorities, and minority populations get, as a result, much harsher sentences. We need to have a very, very strong and solid look into how do we make our criminal justice system fairer, particularly for minority populations.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It is a struggle because, again, we want law and order. There's no getting around the fact that there are people in our society who do terrible, terrible things and need to be held accountable. But I like this idea of going back philosophically. I read somewhere one time, talking about common law, somebody said that really there's only one crime, right? And it's theft. Because if you murder somebody, you're stealing from them. Like whatever else you do, it's just all a form of theft. There's really only one crime. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I'm not sure I entirely agree with it, but I think it's interesting from the perspective of we really need to get law enforcement back to basics, right? Back to basic policing, because they've gone into I say this, I don't even like the school resource officers, to be honest with you. And I say that I don't have any hostility towards police or anything like that, but philosophically, I don't want my kids living in a police state. I don't want to live in a police state. I don't think we need armed and armored cops roaming the halls of our middle schools. I want to stop doing some of that stuff and get back to basics.
On the flip side of that, though, there is some benefit to establishing a relationship between young people and law enforcement if we can take the policing out of the school resource officers' duties. If the response for a resource officer is to do what a police officer does on a normal basis, and that's arrest people who violate the law, rather than help and counsel and guide and educate, I agree with you. But if we put those school resource officers in the school and we allow them to be an advocate and a friend and a confidant for young people in their formative years, I think that there are long-term benefits. It's just very difficult to put. How do you put a cop in a school and tell him to stop being a cop? It's near impossible, right? But that goes back to training, and it goes back to limiting the types of circumstances and things that the police can do in that capacity. One example. There was a few years ago at Fargo, and I'm forgetting the names and everything, but it was a African American teenage boy who was having what appeared to be a teenage moment. Right? We all had them. I was a real jerk when I was 17 too. And he was upset, and he wanted to leave the school, and was trying to get out of the school, and there was a school resource officer there, and as he was moving out, the resource officer kind of moved over, tried to block the kid with his shoulder, right? And they ended up kind of doing a shoulder slam thing, and the student, who probably should have got detention or maybe a suspension, ended up getting charged with assaulting a police officer because while he was having a fit at school, he ran into a school resource officer. The school resource officer kind of moved over and got in his way. And now he's charged with assaulting a police officer. Now he's a criminal. And a felony, whereas if he would have bumped into a school worker that does not have law enforcement authority, it would be a misdemeanor. Right. So I agree. I mean, there are permutations and implications of this that maybe maybe some alternative to the school resource officer as a social worker or somebody from the social services or the Department of Human Services rather than a police officer may be better.
I think so.
I think that comes to the next point that I think is worth mentioning. We need to abolish self-policing. Internal affairs investigations conducted by police officers policing their own just don't set well with the public. They should be conducted by civilians who report to elected leaders. And I don't mean for every instance if a police officer is late for shift briefing, his supervisor should be able to discipline and that type of thing. I think if there's a question of criminal wrongdoing, like I don't know if like you said, if an officer falls asleep in a squad car or something, if they backed into they backed their car in and damaged their car. I mean, that sort of stuff can be handled by supervisors. That's kind of basic employer-employee type stuff. I think where we have the problem is cops breaking the law. You look at the history that's being reported out of Minneapolis, where the officer who killed George Floyd had 18 prior disciplinary complaints. Most of them are inaccessible. Those complaints were investigated by law enforcement. The results and the conclusions were deemed appropriate by law enforcement, and it's unlikely that there was any civilian oversight, that there was any the police are not accountable directly to the electorate like elected leaders. A mayor, a state legislator, a lawmaker of any sort are accountable to the people. If those people misbehave, if people in elective office engage in misconduct, it's conducted publicly and it's conducted by people other than their peers. And I think we have a lot of room for improvement.
Sometimes. I can remember certain senators being let off by the Senate Ethics Committee not so long ago. So the politicians aren't real great at it either. But yeah, it's a problem when, did these cops do something wrong? Let's ask other cops. That's when the kind of thin blue line thing comes into play, and that's a problem.
Another way to regain trust and to, I think, address the anxiety and the tumult that we see from the protesters getting rid of civil asset forfeiture. We take police arrest people, and they take their stuff, and then they convert their stuff to police use. Citizens feel it's like to the victor go the spoils, and the police are policing for their own benefit rather than for the good of the public. There's need for huge reform in that area. Citizens do not trust police because of the fact that the police take their stuff and convert it to their own use.
Well, and I think even expanding on that, a bright line between the actions that police take, writing tickets or assessing other sorts of fines, and their revenue. There should be no tie between the two. The police should not get more revenue because they wrote more tickets. The revenue from that should go somewhere else, and the police appropriation should be based on the debate we have in the legislature about, okay, what resources do our cops need, and we're going to fund those, and it doesn't matter how many tickets they write.
Exactly right. North Dakota historically has done a pretty good job of that. Years and years ago, when our Constitution was reformatted, we established a constitutional principle that said all fines, fees, and forfeitures for violation of state law will be deposited into the state common school trust fund. So if you get a citation from a state patrolman or a sheriff's deputy, or if you're arrested for a crime and you pay fines, that money will go to the Common Schools Fund. So the police can honestly step back and say, we get no monetary benefit from issuing a citation. The problem, though, that we have is municipalities, arguably this is in violation of the state constitution, but cities, city courts, and city police officers directly benefit from fines and fees because we are allowing cities to deposit fines, fees, and forfeitures into their general fund. Yeah. So it's a money-making proposition.
And wasn't that the problem? Wasn't that, I want to say the problem, part of the problem in Ferguson, Missouri, right, where we saw obviously, very, very terrible protests there as well. And one of the reports that went back was that it was sort of policing for like the number of vile tickets that they were writing in particularly in the minority communities was just astounding. It was just absolutely amazing. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily happening in North Dakota, but I mean, that's sort of the thing that can happen. I think, when police sort of can police for profit. I mean, there was obviously, that was a big point of friction between the minority community in Ferguson and law enforcement, is that the cops were out policing for profit.
In the defense of the police, they're being forced to do this by
Elected
lawmakers
officials,
and local
right.
leaders.
Yeah.
And that's the same is true here in North Dakota, where
Yeah.
I don't fault a Minot police officer for issuing a ticket and
Sure.
and being criticized. I fault the Minot city leaders for hoarding money that should be going to the state.
But it's that cop on the
fund.
street that's taking it on the chin from some guy who's, upset because on his way to work he's getting a ticket for 4 miles over the speed limit or something trivial, and he's like, "You're wasting my time. What are you doing this?" And the guy who's hearing it is the poor cop writing the ticket, who's like, "Hey, I'm just doing what my supervisor told me to do." So I mean, yeah, these changes need to start with the policymakers and the elected officials.
And that's really what it turns to: legislation. We abolishing sovereign immunity, criminal justice reform. We can also implement protections for citizens. In the past, our legislature has considered things like abolishing police roadblocks, which are ineffective, which offend a number of people, which put the police in a position to be criticized. If our legislature said we're not going to do police roadblocks anymore for DUIs, the police will follow that. But until the legislature says you can't do it, the police are going to be assertive in their enforcement efforts. So the legislature can draw the lines and to help reinstill trust and confidence in police, or the feeling that a lot of citizens have, normal, average, ordinary citizens, not just minority populations, the feeling that the police are out to get them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I mean, speaking about the legislature too, I mean, and you were talking about this where we have, mandatory minimums and some of the sentencing guidelines. And just the sheer number of crimes that we have on the books. One difficult thing with the legislature is that sometimes, it's when it comes to criminal justice issues, it's like everything's a nail and they're the hammer. And the only thing, there's a line from the Shawshank Redemption, right? When Andy Dufresne's writing to try to get money for the prison library. And I think one of the guards tells him, or maybe it's the warden, tells him that, the only thing the taxpayers are interested in when it comes to prisons is more walls, more bars, and more guards. And there's kind of that approach to criminal justice in general where if we have a crime problem, well, let's make the penalties stiffer, and then let's put more cops on the street. And I don't know. I mean, sometimes that's appropriate. I'm not saying that that's always wrong, but it's much more complicated. We need a far more nuanced approach than that.
And there is a correlation. I don't know that anybody can specifically delineate that correlation, but the protests that we've seen across the country, nobody in Fargo was directly impacted by the Minneapolis incident. Nobody in Tennessee was directly impacted. Yet we have people all over the country protesting against the police as a whole based on one incident. But there's a lot of pent-up anger directed at the police, in large part for the police doing what lawmakers are directing them to do, but it's creating a divide between our law enforcement community and our citizens that I think we as a citizenry and our elected leaders have an obligation to close. And there are ways that they can do it, and they're tough ways. And they'll maybe even get opposition from the police themselves if they reduce penalties and limit police authority. But it's for the benefit of our country and for the benefit of our people.
For sure. Well, Mark, I appreciate this discussion. We went longer than I told you it was going to go, but it's such an important discussion, and a lot of this stuff is going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of work. But I think it all needs to start with a mindset, a shift in the mindset in law enforcement. You're not soldiers. You're not fighting a war. We need fewer laws. We need to ask our cops to do fewer dumb things. And just get back to a place where they can be trusted again, because we've lost that. And I think it's unfair because we have so many great cops and great law enforcement agencies in the state of North Dakota and across the nation that are doing a good job. But there are real problems, and they're getting lumped in with those problems, and we need to solve these problems everywhere. So the legislature's got work to do. Congress has work to do, if Congress ever does any work. I don't know if they do or not. They don't. Let me answer my own question. They don't. They don't do much meaningful at all. I'm being very cynical.
And we have work to do too. We
do.
We need to support police in what they do. We need to support the officers in their actions, but we also need to be critical when they're doing things inappropriately, and we need to call them out.
And it's not anti-cop to do so. It's not anti-law and order to say, hey, this is too far. We need a different approach here. And you can even say, we need a different approach. You please, you're not bad people, but we need you to do your jobs differently. That's not a bad thing at all. Mark, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Anytime, Rob.